is because we want to be good vendors, right? Is we'll find a way to share the consequences. And that's called a compromise. So, if it was the customer's responsibility, then they should absorb them. If it was our mess up, we should absorb them. When it's neither, clearly it's theirs or ours, then we'll probably end up sharing them as a compromise. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's I like how you've kind of detached it in a way and said, well, it's regardless of what you think, that's not in the kind of instructions we're using. So if you want to add it, that's fine, but that's a conversation, right? We're not adding it for free. Yeah.
And that's why I think that it's really important that and it took me a long time to do this, because like I said, when I first wrote the Manage Expectations chapter, I didn't think for a moment that the concept of managing expectations was stupid or unrealistic. And it wasn't until I actually took this example, right? The example of, well, the customer wants this and thinks that that's what they're getting out of the SOW. And I'm like, why is this so hard to argue, right? Like why? And the thing that I started to do when we got into Cirrus One was to start to pick apart every one of these scenarios. Like, but why is it so hard for us to win this argument? And lots of times it boiled down to one of two major issues. The first was we weren't having the argument early enough, which meant that we were becoming complicit in the problem. And so once you become complicit in the problem, it's very hard to make the client the only party responsible for absorbing the impact. Does that make sense? So, we allow the implicit acceptance to walk out of the room. So now we're complicit. And then I go to the client and say, well, but this thing happened and you have to pay for it. And they're like, but how the heck did we get here? You're meant to be leading. So why am I paying for it when you didn't lead correctly, right? That's a very hard argument to have. So we said, all right, what we've got to do is have all of our arguments in the first half of the project. We have to make sure that we tell the client that when they don't give us what we want, that's going to happen. Then there's a couple other circumstances. The elongation of projects and this one are probably the two primary ones that I started to look at. And I'm like, why is this so hard to argue? And it's so hard to argue because we get convinced that the customer's point of view is accurate. The customer's point of view is not accurate. The customer's point of view is an expectation that they created by interpreting information that we're not even aware of. And yet they come to us and they say, well, this is my expectation. And you have to understand that there's another kind of hidden component about expectation. And it's what we call, what I call the fact that that validation informs expectation. And what I mean by that is this. I create an expectation in my head after we'll just call it X, right? But I create an expectation in my head after I read, a document. Okay, I read an SOW. Now, I read this SOW and I create an expectation in my head of what's going to happen. Now, of course, you read the same SOW and you create a different expectation in your head, but you go make that thing and you say to them, let's say we're doing a sprint cycle, we actually build what was in the SOW as per our expectation. Now, the SOW said, I will build a box. Now, the customer now sees the box. They see the what we call the validation of the expectation, right? Or the realization of the expectation, and we ask them to validate it. So the way this kind of works is that the SOW creates the expectation. We then create a realization, right? Which is the actual thing that we think needed to be built. And then what we do is we ask the customer to validate it. And that is the validation. But here's the problem. What do you think happens when the customer sees our initial validation of the box? Well, it says to them, you know what we didn't think of? We didn't think of a lid. We didn't talk about the color. We didn't talk about the type of hinges that were going to be on the box, right? What we actually find is that it's the realization and the validation of the expectation that then creates more expectation. Now, the problem is when the client says these things to you, I was expecting a lid. They weren't expecting a lid. They hadn't thought about lids at all. All that they had thought of was a generic box in their head because that's what they read in the SOW. But now that they see the box, they realize that they didn't think about lids, but they don't say to you, I never thought about lids. They say to you, I also expected a lid. I also expected it to be blue. I also expected it to have brass antique hinges, right? They basically tell you this stuff as if it was an expectation from all the way back here, but that's not true. It's the realization of the actual thing that gives them this enhanced view of what their expectation was. And so you're fighting this no matter how you do the process. And that's why you can't get sucked into the customer's expectation, because it's false. It's false. It's kind of ill-informed. It gets informed as they go along the way, and it keeps changing. I know this because I'm a customer. It's happening to me with the AI stuff that we're building. The guy shows me what he's built, and then I get all these ideas about what else we could do. And I'm like, well, why didn't you think about this stuff? Of course he didn't think about it, because it's my expectation that's changing as we take the journey. So it's a very interesting concept, kind of actually what happens in the customer's mindset. And what we can't do is to get sucked into something that we can't control. Now, that's a lot of stuff, right? That's really, really, deep project thinking once you get down into this level. But does that make sense to everybody? How it works? Or have I scared the living daylights out of you?
Makes sense to me.
And that's why we can't argue with expectation. It's just a stupid thing, because it's outside your control. Now, can we help clients form better expectations? Of course we can, right? The clarity of the communication can have an impact on the accuracy of the expectation. I know, right? But that we can, right? We can be clearer in our communication. But can we control it? We can't control it. We can't manage it, right? I mean, I can read an SOW, JT can read an SOW, David can read an SOW, and we could all imagine something slightly different, despite the fact that we read exactly the same SOW. And unfortunately, that's what happens with expectation. And so the more that we get sucked into an argument about expectation, the more we get sucked into an argument that we can't really control, because it's not about anything that we can control. Good questions, though. Believe me, I love talking about this stuff. Any other questions? Because we've only got 10 minutes left.
So a lot of these expectations might just come out of the fact that we've not been, extremely detailed on an SOW, right? Because, you have to find the right level. You can't include every single little thing, like if you're building a house, what shape the screws are and what size screw. You're not going to include every little thing, but you have to include enough. So I don't know if you have anything to say around that.
Yeah, I have lots to say around that. So here's what we started to look at, because much like the way you guys think, right? I was trained by IBM. And what we believed at IBM in 1994 was that we should nail the client down with our SOW. We should have so much in the SOW that there's no room for the client to negotiate any wiggle room, so that we don't end up with a terrible project. How do you think that worked? It doesn't work. It doesn't work at all.
It'd be a very long time to write it, and then it'd be a very long time to review it.
And all it creates is the expectation of a solution that nobody wants. So where does that leave us, right? So we started to mess around with this at Service One, and let's just take all kind of current knowledge off the table of this stupid approach, right? We know it doesn't work. So what would we do instead? Well, the first thing we would do is actually look at what the purpose of the SOW is, right? In this example, the way that we've set the context for the SOW is that the purpose of the SOW is to tell the customer what we're going to build. Why would it do that? I don't know what we're going to build yet. We just said in principle number 2 that projects are journeys of discovery. And I cannot tell you how important it is that you understand this statement. And I don't mean just read it and go, oh yeah, he's right. I mean, read it and internalize it, because it changed my life. And what I mean by that is that rather than the SOW try to explain the summit of the mountain, what the SOW should be doing is explaining the journey of discovery that we're going to take. And what it should be doing is explaining the roles and stages of the journey, which means it needs less information about what it is we're actually going to build and more information about the things we're going to encounter along the journey to build it. And so we basically reimagined what an SOW should look like. Now, at the end of the day, it doesn't look that different than the SOW that you guys are probably using, except for the fact that it doesn't promise anything. It actually out and out says, we will discover what it is that you want us to build as a part of the journey when you give us all the information that we need in order to process and design a solution. Has no technical documents in it, has no technical architecture, has no technical workflows. It can have some business workflows in it. We basically removed all of the commitment to build any specific thing. And then we say, as a part of this process, we will agree a design document at some point in the future. And that design document will be aligned then with our budget, and we will agree to move forward from there. And if we think about it, that's actually what we're doing. So what's basically happened is that we've fallen into a trap that the SOW should tell the customer exactly what we're about to build. And the reason it reads that way, if you think about it, is because it makes it easier to sell, because it's customer centric, right? So it commits to the customer that we're going to give them an outcome. It actually, what it does is it productizes a service, right? And of course, by productizing a service, not only does it help the client understand what they're going to get and what they're going to pay for, but it also helps sales close the deal. So what that means is that the SOW and the template that we're using today was actually designed to help sales close deals and help the customer understand what it was that it was buying. It wasn't actually created as a contract to help us manage the journey. So what we have to do is we have to take the decision that we're going to use the SOW to help establish the project environment that we want in order to lead the project successfully and rewrite it from that point of view. It doesn't create a massive difference, creates subtle differences, but the subtle differences are very, very important to what's in the SOW. Now, we've done this everywhere, right? We've done this all over the globe. And one of the things that organizations like Vendavo will say is, well, my legal team won't let me do it, or the customer will revolt. None of that is true. We've done this all over the world. And the reality is that if you go as an informed person to legal and say, hey, I don't understand why we do all this stuff in our SOWs. We've seen that in our projects. This is what causes problems. What we need to do is to create a contract that keeps the client accountable as we take the journey. They're going to be all for it. Sales doesn't really give a crap what's in the SOW, nor does the customer, because they don't even read it anyway. So what we found, and what we found when we did this at Cirrus, we completely changed our template for the SOW. Nobody cared. The only organization that cared was an Indian offshore organization who was a service provider, and we gave them like a $600,000 SOW. And basically they said, there's no way we're signing this SOW because there's no way that our clients would ever agree to do this. And so we got their legal and we got their VP on the call, and we walked them through it and we explained it. We said, look, we can't commit to these things because you haven't given us the information yet. We can't commit to giving you, we're not going to push this into production until you accept it. It's that simple. And you get one push to production. Why? Because we're not going to sit here while you guys change your mind about what you want in production. You get one push to production. That's it. That's all that's, calculated into our plan. If you don't keep our team busy, we're going to send them elsewhere. You can't do that. Well, you can't just waste my team's time and impact my revenue either. Oh, okay. So basically we went through the whole conversation. It took 3 hours and we get to the end of it. And basically we reinstated every single clause that we had in the statement of work. But the killer was when the legal guy turns around and says, look, guys, I got to say, now that we've gone through this, we're wondering whether or not we could actually use this SOW as a template for our projects. That's the turnaround that we achieved in a 3-hour conversation about the SOW and the way it was written. So we've been through this now like tons and tons of time, but being able to do this drastically changes, and nobody cares. Nobody cares how you write your SOW. That might be a surprise. People might look at that and think that's not true. Guys, we've done this everywhere. Nobody cares. It's just whether or not we want to write them or not, rewrite them. But the general idea is if you rewrite the SOW so that it helps you control the project environment, it's a far greater asset to you than an SOW that tries to nail the client down into a solution that you don't want to build, that they don't want you to build. But what we do have to do is we have to keep the change orders reflecting what's in the SOW, right? So back to the pink paint situation. If what you decide to do is to do sparkly pink paint and it doesn't cost you anything, then you got to do a $0 change order, right? So that you at least track the changes, because at the end of the day, the SOW as a legal document has to reflect what the parties actually agreed was the end of the project. 2 minutes left. Any questions? Is that a frightening concept that our SOWs are so misaligned to what we actually want?
I think that's kind of, don't think about it much, but when you do think about it, I mean, we don't look at the SOW like every day, right? It kind of sets the scene and then we move on from there, unless there's a contractual debate and then we have to go and relook at the SOW.
Yeah, and that is the funny thing, JT, that we dismiss the SOW so quickly, which kind of explains how wrong it is, right? Like if it was actually useful, we wouldn't dismiss it.
Yeah, totally agree.
Right. So, and this is why we do this training, right? We want people to start thinking about this. And we're not ever saying that because we did this at Cirrus One, you have to go do this. We're not saying that ever. What we are saying, though, is that what we learned at Cirrus One was a way to look at all this stuff in a way that might help you at Vendavo change the way you look at the service that you deliver, hopefully in a more informed way, so that you can begin to make more informed decisions about how you deliver your service. And really what we want as PS principals, we want everybody to start to think more intently about how services gets delivered. Because I don't think that the way that we're categorized inside of Vendavo, inside of the industry, of being bad at implementing projects, which is kind of like how we kind of walk around as if we're like ashamed of our lack of success in project delivery. I don't think that that's true. I think we're actually pretty good at executing projects. It's just the fact that everybody keeps measuring success by this concept of on time, on budget, on scope, which really doesn't mean anything in the context of real success for a customer-facing service delivery. So what we have to do is to start to think a little bit differently about our own service so that we feel better about it, but also so that we can get better at doing it by kind of, shedding the shackles that other people have decided to put on us. And I think that is the most important element. So with that said, guys, we're right up against the hour here. Thank you so much for your time. I truly do appreciate it. Again, like yesterday's group, just great questions. I'd much rather we answer questions about Vendavo specific issues and questions than to use the case study. So as we get into principle number 4, feel free to keep doing that. Feel free to ask questions as we go through the training session. More than happy to talk about that stuff because it gives us stuff that we can talk about that means something to you as opposed to just doing the case study, which is good. It's a value, but I do think that this stuff is of far more value rather than just doing the case study. Other than that, guys, thank you so much for your time. I'll see you in 2 weeks and we'll post a recording to the portal over the next 24 hours. Take care.
Thanks, Shane. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Shane. All right.